What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim, and we are talking Big Ten projected standings, Big Ten playoff picks. Make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. We're going to be starting to get podcasts up Mondays and Thursdays. Next week, we'll have State of the Wildcats and State of the Trojans. And after that, it'll be game week. We'll have game picks. It's going to be a great time. Start of football season. Make sure to hit that like button, smash that subscribe button. Before I get into picks, I do want to respond to a few comments. Got a little feisty in the comments, especially when I dropped the video about the reaction to the notice of allegations. First off, I do want to just mention I was reacting to the news. I think as things continue to come out, I would probably ease my stance that there will be postseason, at least severe postseason sanctions, just based on what I've heard and just what I've read. It's while there is precedent, and I think people forget this, there is precedent for postseason punishments, especially with the level of allegations that there are. It's the allegations are primarily against coaches, although Michigan does have a level 1 violation. My colleague and good friend JR mentioned this on the Big Ten Huddle, and I thought it was a great point that a lot of these allegations are against coaches, many of whom are no longer with the program. So it's going to be hard to punish, and it's not going to make sense to punish with the postseason ban. But that being said, I think a lot of people came at me for that video. First off, I want to respond. Someone had mentioned that all it was clickbait, and I want to just be open and honest. For one, if you guys ever feel like I am just posting for clickbait, like I do welcome being called out on that, because that's not the point or the mission and vision of my show. I want to put this show on to be a reasonable voice in the sphere of college football. I want to be the anti-Paul Feinbaum. I want to be the anti-Colin Cowherd. And so if you guys ever feel like I am being clickbaity, I do welcome feedback. I would push back a little bit that a video about recent college news was clickbait. Someone I asked the question, why is this clickbait? And they mentioned, well, because you're saying that they violated rules and they did this, and I'm like, well, but they did. And I think we have to remember that reporting on news that gets clicks doesn't mean it's not news and that it's clickbait. This is a big deal. We still don't know everything that's going to happen. We don't know what the NCAA is going to do, but everyone is talking about it. And so I wanted to add my voice in. And so I don't think that was the wrong thing to do. I don't think I had all the facts, which, it's a developing story. But I wanted to mention that with that, like if you guys do feel like I am moving in that space, I do welcome the feedback, the correction, because I don't want to do that. That's not my goal. My goal is to be a reasonable voice in the Big Ten, and that's my goal with this podcast. That's my goal in covering teams. I want to be fair to every team, including Michigan. So if you felt that way, I'm sorry. That's not the intent. I do want to point out, I wrote an article for the College Huddle called 5 Nonsensical Statements that have been made about the whole NCAA thing. I'd encourage you to go read it. It's in the show notes below. So click on that. I do want to clarify something. I mentioned the last point that it's nonsensical to say it's a witch hunt. That's not to say that the NCAA hasn't been incompetent. It's not to say that the NCAA hasn't gone after Jim Harbaugh a little harder and oddly at times. And so I don't disagree that the NCAA has looked foolish in the way they've pursued this at times. I think the real issue is Michigan has not helped themselves in this investigation. And so to say that it's a witch hunt when you you continuously add suspicion to yourselves, that's not a witch hunt. That's being stupid. And I'm not saying necessarily that the coaches are being stupid. I think Michigan's PR department's terrible right now. Recently with Jim Harbaugh saying, "I'm coming to the game. I'm not coming to the game. Why are you not coming to the game? Is it because you had the NCAA come after you?" It's like, no, it's because I want to be with my team. Like, we believe that. And Sharon Moore says, "Oh, we don't want to do anything to spite the NCAA. Hashtag Michigan versus everybody." At some point, you got to stop dressing up a pig with lipstick. Like, just own it. And I don't necessarily blame the coaches on that. I blame the PR. Like, public relations, do your job. Read the room. My gosh. Just own it. And so, but because they're not, it adds suspicion. And so that's why it's not a witch hunt. It's incompetence on both sides, but it's not a witch hunt. Like, a witch hunt is presuming that the other side is completely innocent, and that's not what this is. Um, Now, I think the NCAA has not been helpful, but so I just want to point that out. The other thing, there was a long thread in that video, which I ended up deleting because the guy was cursing up a storm, and I just didn't like how the thing was going. But he was mentioning that everybody cheats, and I'm like, that's not an argument. Like, that's not like, you can't just say everybody cheats, so we shouldn't punish anybody. I can understand if you're saying that, and like there's a self-righteous tone to it. Like, oh, everybody cheats and you're just blaming us. And you paint yourself as holier than thou. Like, that makes sense. And I do want to point out, like, Michigan is not the only team that has done stupid stuff, right? And there's been much more severe things morally, ethically, uh, which I won't get into here. But that logic to say, well, everybody cheats, it can be used as a sense to just kind of dismiss everything. And you take that to its logical end, you're basically saying, let's just forget all the rules, which you can't do, right? If the shoe is on the other foot and this is Ohio State, I can guarantee you Michigan fans would want Ohio State just blown to smithereens by the NCAA. Like, if we're just being completely honest. So I don't think that's a good argument. You can't use that argument. The logical end of that argument is, well, let's just abandon all rules and let's be the Wild Wild West, which we kind of are right now, and it sucks. So, like, don't use that logic. By the way, if you use logic, or if you try to talk about that in the comments, I'll respond in the comments, and I'm going to fight on some of these things. Now, if it shows that you don't care or you just don't want to listen, like, I'll drop it and I'll delete the comment thread. But ultimately, I I wanted to respond to that. We can't make that argument in this case. Like, it's just nonsensical. There's a reason why there's rules. Even if you don't like the rule, when those rules are in place, you have to honor them. And you have to dole out consequences when those are broken. So that's it. I've spent 9 minutes too long on that. When this video, you listen to this video to talk about Big Ten projected standings and Big Ten playoff picks. I want to start by saying this is the hardest thing I have done on this show. I've filled out 3 different football schedules. Here, see this? See this? I've done. Oh, you can't. It's blurry. Darn it. Well, for those of you listening to the podcast, I did 3 of these schedules. I did 3 of them. Excuse me. And each time I left very dissatisfied because I would get to records that I'm like, I don't think this team is that good, but I'm saying they're going like 8-4 or 9-3. And then there are other teams where I'm like, I'm pretty sure they're going to be pretty good this year. And then I have them at 5-7. I'm like, what is going on? And I realize, and I've alluded to this in other videos, there's a lot of things we have to keep our eye out on this year. One is that the schedules really matter. We're so accustomed to East and West. Ohio State, you knew 6 out of their 9 Big Ten games every year, right? You knew Wisconsin's at least 6 out of 9 games every year. If you're not looking at the schedules, you will be very shocked that certain teams finish where they do. Especially because I think there are teams that are going to be really good that end up being 8-4 or 9-3. That in most years they'd be 10-2 or 11-1. I think there are other teams where you're like, a good year for them would be 6-6 that end up with more wins because their schedule is atrocious. They got the luck of the draw. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, travel is going to be a factor. Some teams have to travel a lot, especially several of the West Coast teams. They're traveling back and forth from the West to the East. Whereas some teams, Ohio State being one of them, they travel to the West Coast once and that's it. And so that really does play a factor into some of my calculus. Also, the way teams and games are set up. Some teams I have upsetting like a top 15 caliber team only to lose the next week because it's just a tough turnaround and it's an away game and maybe it's a bad matchup. So that it was really hard for me. And then I think lastly, just recognize the floor for the kind of the basement dwellers of the Big Ten. It's a bit higher than it's been. Maybe with a couple of exceptions, but I do think there's more parity in the middle and bottom tiers than before. And because of that, I think you're going to see more upsets, despite the fact that those upsets may come from teams that don't have a winning record at the end of the year. But I think you're still going to see teams. I'll give you an example. I won't say who it is. I have Purdue pulling an upset and I have them not making a bowl game. And I think Purdue actually could be a decent team this year. It's just their schedule stinks. And by stinks, I mean it's brutal. Like their schedule, I mean, they go on the road to Oregon State, they play Notre Dame, they go at Wisconsin, they play Oregon, they play at Ohio State, they play Penn State. It's like that's a bear for a team like Purdue. Like most of those aren't they're not toss-ups. They're like probably 2-score underdogs in most of those games. If they're playing a West schedule, it's a little different. If they were playing a typical West schedule, I'd probably have them going to a bowl game this year. But they play Notre Dame at a conference and they play. So I think just realize that is going to be a factor in these rankings. And so without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go from bottom to top and kind of go through the schedule and any key highlights. I'm not going to go game by game. I'm just going to tell you some of the highlights. So I've got a 3-way tie for last place in the Big Ten. The worst of the bunch, and I'm saying by overall record, is UCLA, 2-10, 1-8 in the Big Ten. And I have them winning their first 2 games and then losing everything else. They start at Hawaii, and then they have an off week, and then they get Indiana at home, which is important because I think Indiana is going to be much improved this year. But I think a road trip to UCLA is going to be a little tough for them, especially as they continue to manage, their new roster. A lot of new players. They'll be coming off probably a couple wins, which we'll get to. But I think that's going to be a tough game for them. to go to the Rose Bowl, and I think UCLA has more talent. Again, I think the floor is a little higher than maybe people expect. The schedule's just brutal. So I said I wouldn't go game by game, but I'll just give you the schedule highlights after their first two games: at LSU, Oregon, at Penn State, Minnesota, at Rutgers, at Nebraska, Iowa, at Washington, USC, Fresno State. I mean, it's awful. And while I think UCLA has the ability to go up and get one, I think what really strikes me is just it's the avalanche. Like they just don't get a break after Indiana. And even Indiana's not a break. Like Indiana's going to be decent, but it's like at LSU, Oregon, at Penn State, that's your next 3 games after Indiana. Like that's what ruins seasons for lesser teams. So I've got UCLA at 2-10, 1-8. Tied for last place is I have Northwestern 4-8, 1-8 in the Big Ten. And it's hard. I feel like I'm going to get more information about Northwestern next week. But just from what I've seen in the transfer portal and the recruiting and who's coming back, I just don't have a lot of confidence in Northwestern. Like and that's not to say that I'm down on David Braun. I think he's a good coach, but they're changing a lot of coaches. He's bringing in his guys. Um, I think that the loss of the quarterback, Ben Bryant, is a pretty big blow. Mike Wright comes in from Vandy. He was at Vandy and he was also at Mississippi State a year ago. They have Jack Lausch. They have Ryan Helinski. Ryan Helinski has not been very good in relief over the past couple years at Northwestern. I think it's a big blow. I'm concerned about the lines. They've hit the transfer portal, but they have not hit it as well as Indiana has. So they've gotten some group of 5 guys: Jalen Pate from Wyoming. They got RJ Pearson out of BCU, who I believe that's an FCS school. They got Richie Haggerty out of Miami of Ohio. Some of these guys are projected starters, but they weren't all stars like some of the guys that Indiana got. And I just like I thought last year was a good year. They also had a pretty decent schedule a year ago, right? They beat Minnesota in overtime. They played Howard. They got Maryland at home. They were able to beat a Wisconsin team that wasn't all that great, or that wasn't great. They beat Purdue by 8, and they got a little lucky at Illinois. And so I think the tide's going to turn a little bit. So I've got them at 4-8. I do have them winning their first 3 games. I think they get Duke. Duke is going to be a shell of who they were a year ago. Mike Elko's gone. Riley Leonard's gone. I think that's going to be a rough. I think Duke's going to have a rough year. But I think it gets tough. Again, I have them beating Indiana, partially because they have a bye week before Indiana. But I think they lose the rest of their Big Ten games at Washington. And I think the big thing, they play Ohio State, they play Michigan, they're at Purdue, they play Wisconsin, at Iowa. It's a rough schedule, and I do think some of what Illinois has to offer in the run game is going to be problematic. So I have them 1-8 in the Big Ten. Also tied for last, I have Michigan State. Michigan State, I also have 4-8, 1-8 in the conference. They start with FAU and then go to Maryland. I have them losing to Maryland. They're non-conference. I didn't know what to make of the game with Boston College. I have them winning just because I do think they are also in transition, and I don't know. I think that Michigan State's their quarterback situation is a little bit better than Boston College's. So I just kind of went with Michigan State there. But again, it gets brutal. Ohio State at Oregon. They play Iowa at Michigan. They do get Indiana at home, but I'm picking Indiana to win that game. And then at Illinois, Purdue, I have them beating Purdue. No, wait, sorry. Yes, I have them beating Purdue on a Friday, and I'll explain why when I get to Purdue, and then losing to Rutgers. So I have them. Their one win in the Big Ten is Purdue at home, and it's a Friday night game. So again, it's gonna. I think it's a tough schedule for Michigan State. I think they don't have a lot of talent. I think they have some guys that Jonathan Smith has brought over. I just don't think it's going to be enough to compete yet in the Big Ten, especially with this schedule. Uh, Tied for 14th in the conference. I have two teams. I have Purdue, 4-8, 2-7 in the Big Ten. This is where things get weird, and it's going to be weird throughout. So they get Indiana State, and then they have an off week. So I have them beating Indiana State. They play Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame's going to be really good. I think they're a playoff team this year. They go to Oregon State, and Oregon State is a bit depleted because of Jonathan Smith leaving them. So I do have them going on the road and beating Oregon State. I think Hudson Card, and this is my feel with Purdue, is I think they are actually going to be a decent team this year. It's just they have a brutal schedule. They play Nebraska at home. I have them losing to Nebraska. They're at Wisconsin, at Illinois, and Oregon. That 4-game stretch is, I think, is underrated and brutal. It's, those two away games bracketed by Nebraska and Oregon, I think, are tough. They get an off week. They do get Northwestern at home. I have them winning that game. And then here's my upset. One of my upset specials. I think they beat Penn State at Ross-Ade. I think Ross-Ade is a hard place to play. I think it's likely that it's a night game. And while I do think Drew Aller does improve, I think if they get into a shootout in a game like that at Ross-Ade, I think that's a type of game where Purdue just shocks the world and beats Penn State. And I think Penn State, while I think they have talent, I do think that they have some deficiency. Losing some of their guys on the defensive end or defensive back end. I think Andy Kotonuki will be an upgrade. I just don't know how I feel about Franklin's influence on the offense. So I'll talk more about Penn State as we get more to the top. I have Maryland tied for 14th, 5-7, 2-7 in the conference. I know I have been on the record. I'm not a Mike Locksley guy. And this is one of those where I am willing to admit that there's probably a little bias here. That being said, Phil Steele, and I think Phil Steele is one of the best in the business. He has a couple of algorithms that put Maryland at 10 wins. And I just have no idea how that happens with their schedule and honestly with their offensive, their quarterback situation. Like I think they're going to really miss Talia Tagovailoa. I know they have MJ Morris coming in. He's fine. I think their offensive line takes a step back. And while I think the defense, gets a little bit better, I just think it's going to be a tough road for them. They have UConn, Michigan State, at Virginia, and Villanova the first 4 games. And so I think they start hot. I think they start 4-0. Then they go to Indiana. I think that's a loss. They get Northwestern at home. I think that's a win. And then this is their last 6. USC, at Minnesota, at Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, at Penn State. I toyed with giving them a win against Rutgers. That was, I think, one of the harder games for me to pick. Ultimately, I have them losing all 6. I think the losses stack. And I think part of it is I don't know if they have the depth on the defensive side of the ball to kind of keep up. And I just don't think the offense is going to be great. Like I know Hemby is back, Caden Prather at receiver, Felton at receiver. Like I do think they have guys. I think they are going to really miss Tunga Vailoa. And I know they were good against Auburn in the bowl game. Auburn stinks. And I think the Big Ten is I think the schedule is hard is going to be hard for them. Tied for 12th in the Big Ten, I have Illinois, 5-7, 3-6. So I do have them missing out on a bowl game. They start out with Eastern Illinois, and I obviously I think that's a win. They get Kansas at home. The first time I went through this exercise, I had them beating Kansas. I think the more I thought about it, the more I don't know if Luke Altmaier and Caden Fagan can win a shootout with Kansas, and they're going to need to because I think Kansas is like I think Illinois' defense is going to really struggle. They lost their two best players on the defensive line in Johnny Newton and Keith Randolph. I'm not sure they've upgraded on the defensive side of the ball. So I just think that's going to be a tough game, despite the fact that it's at home. They do get CMU, so I think they win that game. And then again, at Nebraska, at Penn State, I think they lose those. I have them beating Purdue before losing, again, Michigan, at Oregon, and Minnesota, back to back to back. It's just rough. And then I have them closing out winning 2 out of 3. Michigan State and at Northwestern, I have them losing at Rutgers. So it's that mid stretch for them is pretty rough. And while they have a bye week between Minnesota and Michigan State, I think that's just it's tough for Illinois. Again, if they had a West schedule from a year ago, I think they're bowl eligible. I just don't think that's what happens this year. Also tied for 12th, I have my first bowl eligible team, the Indiana Hoosiers, 6-6, 3-6 in the conference. Again, a lot of this has to do with schedule. They get FIU and Western. I think it's Western Illinois. Their first 2 home games. They travel to UCLA, and I have them losing that game, as I said before. 2 more home games, Charlotte and Maryland. And then I do have them losing at Northwestern because, again, I think Indiana is improved, but I'm not I think it's going to take them a little bit to gel. And I just think away games, it's a bit more of a toss up for Indiana. They have an off week, and then they get Nebraska. They lose to Nebraska, lose to Washington. I do think they get Michigan State. It is at Michigan State, but I think they beat Michigan State before wrapping up losses to Michigan and Ohio State. And then they play the old Oak and Bucket game. And honestly, I just went with the home team. I think Kurt Signetti has the juice. That's not to say I don't trust in Ryan Walter. I went back and forth on that one, and I'm just going home field advantage on that because I think they're probably fairly even teams. I'm going to go to the teams tied at the 10 spot, starting with Minnesota. Minnesota, I have it 7-5, 4-5 in the conference. Again, I think Minnesota, if they were in the West, they're 8-4 or 9-3 this year. If we're going back to the old divisions. I think they get North Carolina at home. I think North Carolina is in a bit of a rebuilding spell. They lost Drake May. They got Max Johnson, which is fine. But I think they're rebuilding a bit, talent on the outside. And I think the line play for Minnesota gets the job done. And so they start there. And I think they beat Rhode Island. They beat Nevada. I think at home, they get Iowa. I think they're going to have a hot start. And then I think reality sets in as they go to Michigan and then play USC at home. I have them losing both of those. I toyed with them getting upset by UCLA, but I just don't think UCLA has the horses. And I think Minnesota with Max Brosmer and I think Darius Taylor, I just think it's going to be too much for UCLA. They get a bye week, which I think it comes at a really good time for them in the schedule. Maryland, at Illinois, at Rutgers, I think they get 2 out of 3 of those. And then they finish Again, if they were in the West, I think 9-3, but they finished with Penn State and at Wisconsin. Um, Honestly, not a bad schedule, and I'm saying that knowing that they have USC, Michigan, and Penn State on that schedule. So it's a tough schedule, but I think they have a decent season at 7-5. Also tied with them is Washington. Washington was a hard team because their entire roster really turns over. I don't know how I feel about Jed Fish, but the reality is Washington has a bit more talent. Will Rogers comes over, decent quarterback from Mississippi State, and I do think they have a bit more of a manageable schedule, all things considered. They get Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern. That's their first 4 games. I think that they start 4-0. I thought at Rutgers was a toss-up game. I have them losing that game. I have them losing to Michigan. I have them losing at Iowa. So I think they lose 3 straight, and then they go into the bye. I have them beating Indiana at Indiana, and then I have them beating USC at home, which we'll get to USC in a bit. Uh, I have them losing at Penn State, losing at Oregon at the end, but beating UCLA, which puts them at 7-5, 4-5 in the conference. I'll get to the top half here, and it's the only non-tied team in the whole standings. Every team is tied with at least one other team except the number 9 team in the conference, and that is Wisconsin. I have Wisconsin at 7-5, 5-4 in the conference. And again, the schedule, I think, holds them back for more wins. Western Michigan, South Dakota, they win those, and then they play Alabama. I I still think Alabama has too much. Um, I I wouldn't be surprised if Wisconsin pulled the upset. Like, I want to see their first 2 games, and I want to see Alabama play their first 2 games. But right now, I think Alabama probably wins by 2 touchdowns. But I'm curious about that game. Bye week, and then they go to USC. I have that as a loss. Purdue at Rutgers at Northwestern. I have them winning all 3. I think they are a cut above each of those teams, including Rutgers, who I'm high on. Losses to Penn State at Iowa, and then win, loss, win, Oregon at Nebraska and Minnesota. I think Wisconsin's going to be better this year. I think they are going to be a better team, maybe even much better. And again, the schedule's the problem. And so I've got them 7-5, 5-4. I have a 4-way tie for 5th. Again, it's messy. 4-way tie for 5th. First team I'll talk about here is USC. I have them 8-4, 6-3 in the conference. I think they get LSU. When I first saw that they were playing LSU, I immediately thought it was a loss. And then you look at the roster, you look at who they lost. I mean, they lost 2 stud receivers. They lost the Heisman winner. You don't just recover from that. And also, LSU's defense might be as bad, if not worse, than USC's was a year ago. And I don't know if what they've done to really improve it. So I'll be honest. I don't know much about LSU. I know there's a lot of hype. I'll just say this. I think USC, I think they'll be hyped and ready to go. And I think Miller Moss with Zachariah Branch, I think with the offense that they have. I know that they lost a lot, but I trust Lincoln Riley to have that offense ready to go, especially against a defense that really has struggled over the past couple of years. So I've got them beating LSU in the opener and beating Utah State. But again, then it gets real. They play at Michigan. I have that as a loss. I do have them winning 5 straight after that. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State. It's Penn State at home, at Maryland, and Rutgers at home. And then I think Washington gets them at Washington. I think that is a tough environment. It's coming off a pretty tough stretch of games. And so I think that's going to be tough for them. And then it's a bye week. And then I've been calling this since March or April. I like Nebraska at USC to beat USC. And so I have Nebraska winning. I think Nebraska's defense is really good. I think Matt Rule, a lot of people want to hate on what Matt Rule's doing. I think he's building Nebraska the right way. And while I think there's going to be growing pains with Dylan Raiola, I I do think Nebraska is going to be better than people want them to be this year. So I've got them losing to Nebraska and then winning at UCLA and then losing to Notre Dame. So 8-4, 6-3 in the conference. Also tied for fifth, I have Rutgers. Rutgers 8-4, 6-3 in the conference. Guys, you have no idea how much I wanted to pick Rutgers to win like 10 games. In fact, I've got my first iteration of this, and I have them 10-2, 7-2. I think the more I thought about it, and the more I kind of tossed it around my head, I'm like, I think their roster is better than it was a year ago. I think Ethan Kaliak-Manis is an upgrade over Gavin Wimsatt. I think the running game is going to be good. I think the offensive line is going to be good. I think the defense is going to be really good. I still don't know if the depth is there to avoid kind of falling apart in games. And that's where I was like, the schedule is much more manageable. But also I don't know how I feel, particularly in the middle of their schedule. And honestly, I was tempted to give them a loss at the end of the schedule because of the depth, my concern about depth. But at the end of the day, I was like, I do think they have more depth than they've had, and it's an easier slate. So I'll just go through it real quick. They get Howard, they get Akron. I think they win both those games. I think they lose to Virginia Tech. I thought about it. I think it could go either way because it's in my mind, it's a toss up. I gave the edge to the home team there. They play Washington at home. I think they get the dub there because of the travel. At Nebraska, I think is a loss. I think Wisconsin is going to be a loss. I just think Wisconsin is probably a bit too thick on the lines. And I do think Tyler Van Dyke is going to be pretty good. They play UCLA at home. I've got that as a win. Then they play at USC. And then the last four games, Minnesota, at Maryland, Illinois, at Michigan State, I have them winning all four. However, I was very tempted to mark them down for a loss. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they're actually at 7-5. Ultimately, I've got them 8-4, 6-3, because I really do believe in Greg Schiano. And I think this is going to be a step up from even last year. I think they continue to build on what they accomplished a year ago. Also tied for fifth. I know you guys are not going to believe that USC or that Rutgers is tied with USC and Penn State, but I have Penn State also in this conversation. I do have them at 9-3, 6-3 in the conference. I think the West Virginia game is going to be a dogfight, but ultimately I think Penn State pulls away in the second half. Bowling Green, Kent State, Illinois, UCLA. I think they're 5-0 going into USC, and I think going to USC is going to be tough for them. And then they go to Wisconsin after a bye week. I think they're okay there. I was tempted to pick Penn State over Ohio State until I talked to the Nittany Blues podcast, and they were like, "There's no way we're beating Ohio State. We don't have the roster. We don't have this." And I was like, "Okay, if you feel that confident about that, then I feel confident to trust your opinion." And I'll talk more about Ohio State here in a few minutes. They get Washington at home. I think that's a win. I've got them losing at Ross-Ade. I think part of that is a coaching thing. I do think Purdue is good enough to pull an upset like this. And again, I think if there's any team that goes to Ross-Ade this year that is capable of having a blunder like that, I don't think it's Oregon. I don't think it's like I think Oregon is probably too efficient offensively to do that. And I don't think Purdue's defense is going to be good enough to do that. But I do think Penn State can get stuck in the mud. And I think Dylan Thieneman is good enough to pick Drew Aller off if he tries to throw downfield. And I think Hudson Card could get hot. And I think that could prove problematic for the Nittany Lions. So I've got Purdue upsetting Penn State, and then they finish off with wins against Minnesota and Maryland. And then the last team in my four-way tie for fifth is Nebraska, also 9-3, 6-3 in the conference. Their schedule is very, very easy in the first 7 games. At least relatively easy. UTEP, Colorado, Northern Iowa, Illinois, at Purdue, Rutgers, at Indiana. And that's not meant to be a shot at any of those teams. I just think, I think Colorado, I think they're overrated. I think they might lose game 1 against North Dakota State. That's a tough FCS team. And then they got to play Nebraska, they want nothing more than to put 100 on Prime and his boys, and it's at home. Then it's Northern Iowa. I think they get that. I think they have the edge against Illinois in the trenches. I think they have the edge in the trenches against Purdue. I think they're a little bit more talented than Rutgers, and it's at home. And then at Indiana, I think the trenches, they're a little bit better. And then I think, the last 5 games are tough. At Ohio State, they play UCLA. Then there's a bye week at USC, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. I think they pull off the upset at USC because of the trench battle. And I think they lose to Ohio, and I think they beat UCLA, but I think they lose to Wisconsin at Iowa. But I still think they finish better than Wisconsin, or they finish better than Wisconsin. They do not finish above Iowa, Iowa beats them on the field and they beat them in the standings. They are tied for third. I have them 10-2, 7-2 in the conference. Again, the first 3 games: Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, wins, and then they go to Minnesota, and I picked Minnesota. I think they lose a game that you're like, why'd they lose that one? And I think Minnesota is good enough to make them pay. I think Brosmer is good enough to get enough on that defense. And I think Minnesota is going to be a little bit better than people expect. It's at Minnesota. So I think they lose that game, and then they play Ohio State after the bye week. I think that's their other loss. But then the rest of the schedule, they get Washington at home, they get Wisconsin at home, they get Nebraska at home, and then their away slate. It's really, aside from Ohio State and Minnesota, it's really the away games that I would want. Michigan State, UCLA, and Maryland. And so I think Iowa wins those games. But so I have them finishing tied for third, 10-2, 7-2. We're not going to get Iowa in the Big Ten championship game, despite the fact that I was thinking about it. Before I get comments saying, have you seen Cade McNamara and how bad he is in the scrimmages? I just want to tell you, I don't care. I don't care, because did you see their quarterback play a year ago? And they still, I think they were either 9-4 or 10-3. Like, this is Iowa we're talking about. And I do think that Tim Lester is going to get things going, which is why also I think in the beginning of the season, they might stumble at Minnesota, and I think they will lose to Ohio State. But I think as Luke Lachey gets back involved in the offense, as Cade McNamara gets more comfortable in the offense, I do think they will be rolling by the second half of the season. Rolling relatively, right? Because Iowa offense, we judge it on a scale, like it's on a curve. So, but Iowa has proven time and time again they don't need an offense to get to 9 or 10 wins. So the other team I have tied for third, and this is probably my shock, and it was a shock to me as I was thinking about it, is Oregon. I have Oregon at 10-2, 7-2 in the conference. And I'm shocked not just by the record, I'm shocked by how I have them getting there. But just stay with me. I think they beat Ohio State in Autzen, which probably begs the question, where are the two losses coming from? And I'll tell you where they're coming from. At Michigan, at Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin is good enough to get them. It's at Camp Randall. It's a tough environment. It's, a long season where they've been commuting across the country almost every other week. It's near the end of the season, not a lot of buys. They it'll be have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 straight weeks without a buy, and their away games in that last stretch, it's at Purdue, at Michigan, at Wisconsin, all within a 4-week span. That's a lot of travel, and I just think it's gonna catch up to them. And I think Michigan, I think their defense is gonna really stymie Oregon. Like, I don't think they'll completely stop them, but I think that's just gonna be a tough nut to crack. And I don't think Oregon, like, I think Michigan has quarterback issues. They still have an offensive line, they still have a running back, they still have a tight end that are all really good. And I think that's going to matter. And so I think there's a really good game in the big house with Oregon and Michigan. And because it's at home, because of the line, I'm picking Michigan there, and I'm picking them to lose in an upset to Wisconsin because of just exhaustion. Then they get an off week and they get Washington at the end, and I think they win that game. But again, schedule, travel. Like I think people, if you're thinking about it from like a video game standpoint, you're like, well, the second best roster, the best roster in the Big Ten is Oregon. I don't disagree with you. I think the travel is going to kill them. Like I think ultimately they will struggle with the travel. So those are 3 through 18. Those are my teams there. My top two, and there's a tiebreaker here, so they're tied, but they're not really tied. But they'll rematch in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State and Michigan. Let me start with Michigan. I have Michigan 10-2, 8-1 in the Big Ten. I think they lose to Texas, and I hope and pray they lose to Ohio State. And I'll tell you, I almost biasedly picked Ohio State to lose to Michigan because I don't really trust Ryan Day, and I think that's more just like post-traumatic stress from the past 3 years. But if I'm being honest, I just think Ohio State's roster overall is better. They'll have gelled with Will Howard. And I think Ohio State's defense is good enough to limit the run game and force, whether it's Orgy, whether it's Jack Tuttle. I think for Michigan's sake, I hope it's not Jack Tuttle. Um, I I just think I think that's going to be a tough ask, especially in the horseshoe with the talent that Ohio State has. Um, I've been wrong before, and I always do this, and I'm like, oh my gosh. I thought Ohio State was going. This was the year that Ohio State was going to come back and beat Michigan, and of course they don't. So I'm a little scared to make that pick because in at least one of my iterations, I had Michigan beating Ohio State. I think though, as I was trying to think of the pathway forward, I'm like, no, I think it's a home game for Ohio State. I do think there's limitations on the offense that are going to be problematic, especially with the defensive personnel for Ohio State. So, but I do have Michigan beating Oregon at home. I have them beating USC at home. They go to Washington, and I was tempted to pull the trigger for an upset there. I think again, travel matters. You know what cures a lot of ills? Defense and a running game. And I think they have that in spades. I think they're going to make a lot of quarterbacks miserable this year, including good ones. So I've got Michigan 10-2, 8-1 in the conference, and the first of two Big Ten championship participants, which the other one being their rival, Ohio State. I think they lose to Oregon, and I don't think they lose to anybody else. And part of my rationale for losing to Oregon, it's twofold. One, it is their only trip out west, and I think that does, I think that is significant. But they're also coming off playing Iowa, and Iowa, I think, is going to rough them up a little bit. And I think they're still going to be getting used to things, trying to gel offensively. And I could see that game getting into a shootout and, maybe the game getting away from them in the fourth quarter. So I think there's a legitimate pathway for Oregon to beat Ohio State, even though I think Ohio State's probably a little bit better on the lines. I could see where Will Howard, maybe there's miscommunication. They're struggling with the noise and Autzen, and that really messes them up. But I think after that, like Nebraska and at Penn State, that's a tough turnaround. But I don't think Nebraska has the offense to really overcome Ohio State's defense. And then I think, at Penn State, it's similar. I think defensively they might be good enough to hang for a while, but I don't know if the offense is going to be good enough, especially on the line. And then I'm picking Ohio State over Michigan. I think I just think the roster is a little bit better. And because of that, yeah, I just think that's going to be tough in that game at home. I'm not going to pick the Big Ten championship game, although I wouldn't be surprised if it's Michigan, just because I think it's hard to beat the same team twice, which I think might actually set up a three-peat, depending on who wins and loses that game and where they're seated. I do think both Ohio State and Michigan make the playoffs, and I think Oregon makes the playoffs. I do not think Iowa makes the playoffs. And let me explain why. I think Oregon has a good enough schedule to have 2 losses and for the committee to be like, oh, this team's really good. A win against Ohio State, you lost at Michigan, you lost at Wisconsin, which Wisconsin's a respectable team. You went on the road and played at Oregon State, which I don't think will be much. But I think that win against Ohio State will loom large, and I think that gets them in probably like around an 8 or a 9 seed. I think Michigan probably is like going to be a 6 or 7 seed if they lose the Big Ten championship game. Obviously, they'll be a top seed if they win. And then Ohio State, if they go 12-1 and beat Michigan, they're a top 2 seed, easy. And depending on what happens in the SEC, possibly the number 1 overall seed. So those are my picks as we approach the season. Let me know where you think I'm wrong, because I'm sure you do. We've got some great content coming. I'm going to try to get some guests on here to talk about to help me make picks for week 1. I just had the privilege of chatting with Matty O and TJ from Common Fan, and if they're not in week 1, I'm going to get them for week 2 for that Nebraska-Colorado matchup. They're a hoot, guys. If you want a good Nebraska podcast, make sure you check into Common Fan. Of course, they're part of the College Huddle community. This podcast is also part of the College Huddle community, so make sure you are locked and loaded into that. Again, check out the article I wrote on the College Huddle. I'm going to try to write a little bit more as I have time, because I have all the time in the world, right? There's sarcasm. Again, thanks for listening. If you want to catch this on YouTube as well, I'll try to do cut-ups of each team, 2 to 3 minute segments. But again, really appreciate. I'm excited. We're here. 2024 college football season is upon us. It's going to be exciting. Thanks for listening. Take care. God bless.